Can you both speak to, I think horrifically because of necessity, but in a way that is potentially very dynamic, there is a lot of labor action right now. Now, again, I don't want to romanticize this in any way because it is a product of the most craven brutality of companies like Amazon. And at the same time, people are saying no. And this is quite significant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, which this was also the case, in the last enormous labor upsurge. Well, what I was going to say was that in the 30s, like right. When that was the last time that the labor really kicked off, and that was also in response, to horrific conditions that people were facing. Although at least they weren't facing the kind of pandemic that we're facing now. I mean, the opportunities are enormous. I mean, in the book, just beyond the pandemic, in general, post Bernie, we talk about the kind of two tracks of like social movement organizing, especially focused on the labor movement and elections. And we talk about elections. I mean, maybe this doesn't need to be stated, but like we wouldn't be having this conversation if Bernie Sanders had not run an electoral campaign. It was his decision to run for the presidency of the United States that brought us to this point where it has produced all of these new opportunities. And I say that because there is this perennial debate on the left. It's like, should we do social movements or should we do elections? And Bernie's campaign showed us that like that's a kind of false choice, that you can actually do elections in a way that can help lead to all kinds of new, labor movement energy and sort of organizing, grassroots organizing energy. So, we talk about, in the election section, I mean, we have some kind of principles. Maybe Megan, if you want to explain that kind of the argument for a class struggle electoral strategy for how we go about our elections.
Yeah, so in 2019 at the National Convention of the Democratic Socialists of America, there was a resolution that was submitted and passed to commit ourselves to a strategy called class struggle elections. It's basically trying to narrow down what DSA thinks are like elections worth engaging in, because everybody in DSA will tell you like, look, we understand that electoralism is a phenomenon and it's historically a problem for the socialist left, thinking that you can actually just kind of like elect your way into transformative change is an issue. And then, of course, abstentionism is also a problem, because if you just sit on the sidelines and snicker at all the stupid people going up there and attempting to make change at the ballot box, I mean, you're essentially just ceding that territory, that extremely important territory, to your opponents, and also not meeting people in the space where they're thinking about politics, because like it or not, that's where people put their political energies, right, is in the electoral sphere. So to reconcile that problem, DSA has been trying to come up with some criteria for what would be a good election to participate in. And so we passed this resolution on class struggle elections, which contains some outlines, some guidelines. And then Micah and I just wanted to flesh it out. Like, we wrote this chapter of the book, and then we wrote a second chapter with examples to try to like really demonstrate what we think differentiates a normal election, even a normal election by a progressive who might agree with us on some policy stuff, from a class struggle election, which is an election that exists to actually heighten the level of class struggle. And the three criteria that we came up with were: one, raise the expectations of the working class. There are a lot of ways you can do this. Rhetoric is certainly one of them, but platform is really significant. Think about Bernie and Medicare for All. It wasn't poll tested. It wasn't like people wanted universal health care, but that's like vague. He was like, here's a policy that's not popular, and I'm going to put it forward, and I'm going to raise your expectations for what you can reasonably deserve from a functioning society as a working class person, and was enormously successful in this regard.
We quote the AOC from when she was at the Queen's rally for Bernie, where she says, when Bernie's first campaign started, I was working as a bartender, and I did not believe that I deserved healthcare. And like Bernie Sanders convinced me that I do deserve healthcare, which to me is like one of the most powerful moments to come out of the campaign, is a real testament to exactly what we're talking about with raising expectations. Like, Bernie Sanders is campaigning on Medicare for All, made millions of people believe that they deserve Medicare for All.
Right. Right.
I listened, and I just want to add as a note to that I listened to the symposium that you did with several people, including Adolph Reed, and he made a really good point about how we also have to acknowledge that that's not necessarily permanent. Like, we've raised people's expectations, and like that can be wiped away in an instant. It can be a sort of like a period in the past where people were more open to this idea if we don't capitalize on it, which is why the other two are really important. The other two criteria, the second one being to polarize along class lines very explicitly. And the way that we explain it is this: the Republicans are very good at division. And the Democrats are very good at false harmony. So the Republicans will be like, you should hate your neighbor because your neighbor is an immigrant. And the Democrats will be like, don't hate anyone. And in fact, don't hate Blue Cross Blue Shield, even though they're denying your medical claims.
Right.
You know, like it's
a big country. It involves undocumented people, and the people that won't pay for your kid's inhaler, all coming together.
All coming together.
Right,
exactly.
Right.
So like what we're proposing is a form of unity / division that kind of takes the best elements of both. Like, we don't want false harmony. There are in fact interests in society that are diametrically opposed to one another, and specifically class interests, and we're going to make that extremely explicit. And at the same time, we are going to promote unity among the vast majority of society, are going to be unified across lines of difference against those people who they're most different from. Right. And those corporate actors that they're most different from. So that is like a central, if a campaign isn't doing that or isn't willing to do that, or if the candidate demonstrates that they don't actually have that grasp, then that it's probably not going to rise to the level of a class struggle electoral campaign. And
so can I just say just to fill it in? I mean, and I don't want to look, a lot of different folks approaching politics different ways in this audience, but I'd say, like, Andrew Romanoff, certainly if I lived in Colorado, I'd vote for him. I think he's actually, I'm certainly glad it's going to be him instead of Hickenlooper. He's got some good progressive positions. If you want to volunteer, great. I'm in no way discounting that. But by this model, cool, go vote for him. That's a better person to have in the Senate. Keeping Rashida Tlaib in the House has class implications. Right. And say, I always hesitate to do this because you're always inevitably leaving people out. But let's just say, because it's the leadership, Michaela Wilkes taking on Steny Hoyer and Shahid Buttar taking on Nancy Pelosi, explicitly identifying a serious class base of why they're taking on these Democratic leaders that have done so much for corporate America and harmed the working class so much, frankly. That's kind of the dynamic we're looking at.
Yes, exactly. I think that's exactly right. And then the third criteria actually helps because you could end up with a list similar to yours, but you could still be missing this fundamental characteristic, which is like you could have a great candidate, but they could sort of be coming out of the ether and representing only themselves. And maybe they actually have the right viewpoint, but they don't have a connection to an organic working class base. They don't have a constituency. They're not interested in building one, and they wouldn't necessarily be accountable to one. I mean, just structurally speaking, even if they had a golden heart, they just wouldn't be accountable to a working class constituency because they don't come from a working class constituency, or they don't have relationships to organizations that represent either the working class itself, like unions at their jobs, or represents something like DSA, which is, a pro-worker organization with like a very pro-worker ideology. So this third one is the idea of building movements and being able to sense a commitment to building and strengthening movements in a candidate, which sounds really vague, but we try to spell it out in the book precisely what we mean about that. And then the way that the campaign is run also needs to be building movements in the process of running the campaign. And we gave some like illustrative examples of what that looks like in the book. The one that probably is easiest to digest being in Oakland, in the East Bay, where we ran a Democratic Socialist for the state assembly and we lost, but the infrastructure that we built up in that campaign, we turned on a dime to apply to a labor solidarity campaign for the Oakland teacher strike. So instead of dissolving the campaign infrastructure, we basically just sprung it into action and in a non-electoral sphere. And like, that's kind of what we're talking about in terms of building a campaign that actually has the capacity and the interest to do that sort of thing. So those are our 3 criteria. I could go on forever about it, but I'll stop. And then there's labor stuff, which Micah can talk about.
Yeah, let's get, and I'll just add one more, another Adolf Reed, which is the idea of the relay race, which is you run your part. The main action has been the Bernie campaign. It didn't succeed, but it generated an enormous amount of literally trained people. There's all of these things, and then you go and you pass it, like a relay race. Micah, please, specifically on the labor component, if you can, in the last couple of minutes.
Yeah, so labor is obviously completely it is so critical to be building up. I mean, one of the lessons that we should take from the Bernie campaign is that, like, we may have this reborn socialist movement that is inspiring, that we're a part of, but we can't just do this on our own as a new socialist movement. Like, we actually really suffered because we have a really weak labor movement right now. And we don't have enough people within that labor movement who are willing to take stances like, fight for an endorsement of Bernie Sanders. Like, so on the electoral level, the weakening of labor, I think that was a really critical part of what went wrong, with why we're unable to get Bernie to victory. But beyond elections, the labor movement is the central institution that we need to be building if we're going to have a robust working class movement and a robust left. Bernie used his campaign to not just talk about the importance of workers, but used his campaign infrastructure to turn people out to picket lines. Megan has she wrote a great section. I think the conclusion of the book where we talk about that Brooklyn rally where Bernie brings up the president of the United Electrical Workers local, who's talking about the strike that they were waging in Pennsylvania, and the whole crowd is chanting like strike, strike, strike. Yep.
13,000 people chanting strike. You never seen anything like it. It's crazy.
I lost my voice at that one.
Whenever you get the chance to chant strike with 13,000 people, you got to do it at the top of your lungs. Right. So rebuilding the labor movement.
Bernie came out to Santa Gold. There was a lot of energy at that one. Yeah.
So that rebuilding of the labor movement is critical. And that's something, Megan and I were on a call the other night with the members of the Young Democratic Socialists of America, I think, who asked us kind of tongue in cheek, like, how do we create the next AOC? And like, that's an important question to ask, but also people should be, just as important as whoever the next AOC is going to be is like, who are the next rank and file teachers who are going to go on strike? Who are the next people who are going to take from the energy from the Bernie campaign to go and rebuild the labor movement, whether as, rank and file workers, especially, socialists and others who are class struggle minded, who are going to go into their unions and transform them into democratic and militant bodies, that can have enormous, I live in Chicago, where like the Chicago Teachers Union, through its willingness to do that, has totally reshaped the politics of the entire city. That is a central task for people who are inspired by Bernie going forward, to take the energy from the campaign and use it to rebuild a labor movement. If we're going to actually have a chance to not just like go on strike and do all the things that we know that are needed to be done in order to rebuild working class power, but also win an election with whoever the next standard bearer of the left is, who's running on a presidential level or whatever, we're going to need a rebuilt, strong democratic militant labor movement in order to do it. So that's a central task going forward.
Absolutely. Well, guys, I really appreciate both of you so much. The book is Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism. You can find, of course, Micah and Megan's work at Jacobin and every other place where you can read and listen to and watch good things. Appreciate you guys. Thanks so much. Stay safe.
Thanks so much for having us on.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Too.